first of all, thank you for stopping by, Daniel. I always so much appreciate you coming by and take the time
Of
and
course.
talk with me. So before we really start, you just had a book out under the wing, right?
You sure did.
Which you wrote with your wife
That's
under
right.
OG Rose. And that's a collection of short stories, right?
Yep.
Is
Yes,
it
sir.
different for you to write like non-fiction instead of just non-fiction books?
That is a great question. Funny enough, Michelle and I actually started doing fiction. Like OG Rose was started in 2011 because we were working at Eunoia, which was an art gallery, venue, and performance place we helped run. And we would sit on the back and go through the short stories or talk. She would be doing her project Flashlight. I would be doing like the novel turn digressions, The Savior, these various short stories. So that's really where we started. And I would certainly say, like, when I was growing up as a kid, I basically walked through the woods and came up with science fiction stories. The main one was called The Sword of Tribulation. I wrote 8 books of it, and worked on that. So fiction and literature is really where OG Rose starts. And that's really what we were focused on getting published and printed with the various magazines between, say, 2014, 2018. But there was this conundrum. The conundrum is the following. So a lot of the publishers or agents want you to have a platform before they represent you. They want to see that you've built a platform and so on and so
Right.
forth. But there's only one problem. If you put any of your material online, they won't publish it. So how in the world do you build a platform? How do you go about doing that? It seems to be a kind of a catch-22, right? There was also other things going on in the industry. We did have some publications, that are listed on OG Rose with various magazines, poems, short stories, Right Lawns with Esperanza, Pushcart. I could go on, but what ended up happening is a lot of this fiction is also written alongside philosophical papers
Right.
that actually the idea is you write a philosophical paper and kind of leave it behind to write the story so that it
Yes.
is infused in the story but implicitly. So we had this kind of all of these philosophy works that we had, and we said, well, why don't we use these to try to build that platform, not the fiction, so that we can still get that, send that off to agents and different things. And then gradually and slowly, all these philosophy papers worked on. But I'll say that the difference, to answer your question, a lot of the difference with fiction is it has to be written in a manner where the reader forgets that they are reading a sentence, like that they actually are taken into a place where they almost
Right.
forget they're reading, which of course is kind of an impossibility, right? How does someone while reading forget that they're reading? While looking on black marks on a piece of paper, forget that they're looking on black marks on a piece of paper, right? How do you do that? The sentence, to give the quick answer, the sentence structure changes dramatically. The way that you pull the reader in changes dramatically. And I'll say the big shift in just the writing of the sentences themselves is that although in a nonfiction work, of course, there's various, I'm not saying there's no elegance or anything to nonfiction. That's not the case at all. It also depends on what kind of nonfiction. There's the literary fiction essay, there's
So,
more of the dense philosophy essay, et cetera, so forth. But the main thing that has to happen, to give an example from the novel Turn the World, and then I'll give it back to you, is if I have the sentence, at the end of the hall was mom's room, and I walked down it. You say, okay, all the information was communicated. That's great. But let's take the second sentence. I walked across the creaking hall to mom's room and knocked on the door. So between both of those sentences, it's the same information. But actually, the second sentence is far superior to the first sentence. And the reason is because in the first sentence, you go to the end of the hall, see mom's room, and then jump back and walk it. Well, that's very jagged, right? Instead, in the second sentence, Don is the character is walking down the hall to the mom's room and then knock on it. So the way the information is relayed maintains a realistic sequence of how the character would move through the hallway to get to the door, right?
right.
That kind of thing becomes very pronounced in creative writing. Whereas, say, in philosophy or so forth, you don't have to worry about that so much. So that would be kind of a first thing that comes to mind. There are
That's
certainly
that's
significant
such a
differences.
Daniel kind of way to answer this question. No, because like I wrote nonfiction books. I wrote fiction books. I wrote philosophy books. I wrote like two or three novels. Two,
Oh,
two, I guess. And for
wow.
me, it's like it's very hard to do this novel kind of stuff, this literature, because it requires a completely different part of my brain.
Yep.
I can't approach it like logically. It's like
That's
as I
right.
as I do like a more philosophical text. And so I struggle with this. It's like if I have a philosophical text, I know when something is formulated, precise, and that I can stand and that I'm happy with it. With literature is something else entirely.
Yes, it
And
is.
so I was wondering how that is with you, if you prefer one style over the other, which comes more easy to you, with which are you more struggling?
That's a great question. I find successful literature is far more rewarding and impactful, but far harder. Whereas, because with philosophy, like you say, you have a sense when the argument works. You have a
Right.
sense of when it is complete. But if we're talking Esperanza, and you're trying at the twist to make sure it emotionally impacts the reader in a manner where they really feel the tragedy or trade-off of competing goods that Esperanza is dealing with, and how see in the midst of that trade-off, like the Colossus of Rhodes standing on two sides of the river, makes a decision because he's caught between the tension of telling someone how he feels and putting that person's life at risk and showing them, but they may not interpret what she shows them correctly. And so he has to make a decision between those things, right? It is every sentence cannot break what James Wood said was the trance of believability. Like everything has to be worded to where when you get to the climax moment of, say, Esperanza, there is no moment where the reader is pulled out of the story. They have to be in it with Esperanza. Esperanza was written in 2015, and there are 32 rewrites of it because of,
Yeah.
you think you do it, but not. You have people read it. You thought it worked. It doesn't. You rewrite it. You rewrite it. You rewrite it. But if it works, it is for me far more rewarding. And I think it has an impact that philosophy can't have, even if philosophy is important, even though philosophy is invaluable, even. When you have a story successfully, Michelle and I will say, stick the landing, it does something to person. But here's actually, for us, kind of, dare I say, the goal of fiction in OG Rose. All of the stories are philosophically informed to lead to a choice that a person has to make that cannot be reduced to a rationality, that cannot be, it's led up to by a logic, but the choice itself has to have a kind of raw humanness, if you grant me that, to it, right? It can't be
Sure.
entirely justified. So there's a certain nakedness in the choice, and that is the power of it. Um, and the story should work in a manner that makes you actually believe in philosophy and actually see its value, but precisely in a certain leaving behind of it in the climactic moment. So to me, they
Right.
inform each other. But certainly literature I find harder but more rewarding, whereas philosophy is easier, but doesn't necessarily have that same boom, I want to say, that you're looking for.
Okay, so let's dig a little into this because you got a review by our friend Greg Dember, from a more meta-modern lens. So in a kind of way, transitioning from literature to philosophy now. Is that frame, is that something as a writer of fiction, is that something you identify with? Because like metamodernism as a philosophical theory about art, also, adjacent to it, performatism, coming from Raoul Eshelman, who has this idea that, because you mentioned this, the protagonist has to do a choice, but it also reflects a choice that the reader has to do, and there's a form of interactivity, which is kind of a new literary device after postmodernism. Is that so? The question would be if if that would be a frame to understand your literature, would you think that is a useful frame? How would you describe your literature that you write? How do you go about it?
Magnificent question. I greatly appreciated Denver's review of the story Heroes, and in no way whatsoever, when Heroes was written, that came in a fury of around midnight in 2011, and I stayed up till 5 in the morning to write the whole story out, and then rewrote that for 10 or so years. And no way whatsoever did I say this is gonna be a meta modern story. However, reading Denver's tremendous book, absolutely the way he is describing metamodern, I want to draw attention to how he does it,
Right.
actually is certainly describing, without me being aware of it, of what I was trying to do with the character Eve. And like the key to how Denver, and I really think Denver's take on metamodernity as a critical theory it offers a critical piece to the puzzle. Because, obviously there's the idea of the oscillation between the modernity and the post-modernity, right? The key thing that Mr. Denver stresses is that this oscillation is for the sake of a certain preserving of an interior space. That also, that interior space, even if we can't have certainty about what that person is thinking about, the raw emotional experience itself, we can't have certainty in. Like, I don't know if what I'm happy about, I'm right about, but I can be certain that I'm happy because I am having that experience, right? So there's this movement between what is, for say the character Eve, what is real and what is not false, but ultimately for the sake of the impact of the end of the emotional experience of her choice. So this story is absolutely playing with an oscillation between is she a superhero or is she not a superhero for the sake of the impact. And that's what Denver brought to the forefront at the end. Now, I will say, I would say, because Under the Wing, kind of the hope of those stories is kind of move between different things. I would say different sort of genres. I would say Heroes is certainly, it's the most meta-modern piece. The White Man is an existentialist text, like a Camus. I have Camus in mind. The third story, Esperanza, is supposed to be a fairy tale in a literary fiction structure. The fourth story, which is going to be Olive Leaves, is supposed to be more confessional. Ludwig is supposed to be more of a kind of philosophical text, and I have in mind there just sort of something like maybe The Fall, more so, of Camus. After Ludwig, I believe that's when you get Show. The idea of that is to be modernism, which is actually bringing particularly the novel Snow Country in conversation with Russian literature. I believe the one after that is Sleeping with Humanity, which is supposed to be postmodern. The seventh one is Hoop, which is intentionally the quote-unquote it's the most nihilistic, dismal story to actually show how rationality works. Kind of almost of a Dada. The eighth is Inside, which is postmodern again. And the ninth, Under the Wing, is supposed to be Southern fiction in the vein of Faulkner, but a Faulkner that finds himself alive in 2020. So those are kind of how I would, in terms of genre, describe each one of the stories. So it's not like Under the Wing is supposed to be a meta-modern collection. Each story ends up being perhaps best analyzed by a different literary theory because of what the story turned out to be. I don't think it's a good idea to say, I'm going to write a postmodern story. I'm going to write a modern story. What you do is you have the bolt, the strike, where you have the notion of the story, and then it unfolds in the manner that is proper. Now, that sounds all kind of woo-woo because one has to get into how it works.
Not at all. But the question is still, it's like because you mentioned postmodernism, existentialism, metamodernism, is that a frame that you use a lot, or is that pure convenience, or is that a frame that you find useful, in your own work?
I find frames like that are fine to use at hand, but I don't really use them in writing work. Instead, mostly what I do is like Under the Wing, I got all my Faulkner books together, I got all my Flannery O'Connor together and read all of those books to get the, because I had a sense of this story. Mary Rose is a character that I associate with Faulkner. Therefore, I will get Faulkner in my system as much as I can while I am reading it. So, or I will verbatim copy a whole lot of paragraphs out of Faulkner or Flannery O'Connor until I get that style and then throw all of that away and then go work it. Because to me, I guess I think of, instead of thinking literary genres like Southern fiction, I think more writers like Faulkner, like Flannery O'Connor, who you could describe as Southern fiction. But to me, it's more like writers I associate with.
So funny that you say that, and I didn't want to go into this, but there are some things, in preparing for this talk. I was reading up on Camus actually, and the funny, because you say this, I this is half a year ago, and I have a Substack, and I wanted to write an article, and I was like, okay, let's do an experiment, and I was taking a text from like a first chapter from a book of Camus. And I was looking at the structure of argument that he was like doing. And I was like, okay, let's try this. And I used basically his structure of argument to present my own case, a little bit different, but it was quite interesting. And the result, what I got mostly was, oh, that's a shitty text, But I found it quite funny because I was actually actually kind of copying what he was doing. So anyway, yeah. So you also have a podcast, which I want to mention because I find, the philosophical investigations you do on this podcast, next to what Cadell Last is doing with his stuff, I find this is outstanding. And it's called The Net, and it's one of the best philosophical podcasts there is, in terms of, actual investigations of topics, right? And so maybe you take, a minute or two to actually set up and explain what you're doing there.
Well, I appreciate all those kind words. And no, absolutely. Well, initially with the net, there was this idea of, I'm meeting all these wonderful people online, but there's a whole lot of logistical demand to coordinate time to see each of these people. What if we did just a weekly get together at a certain time in a certain place where people
Right.
get the email, and if they're available, great. Because I had in mind, I grew up hanging out in a diner called Hud's. It was called Big T, then Hud's. And you'd be there at the fish fry, and Mr. Dillard would come in, or Mr. Chapman, people would come or go, and there'd be a continual conversation. So I had kind of a diner model in mind. And what also that is doing is creating a space where there is no set topic. So whatever is at hand for people, that's what we go into. And what's very, I think, important with it is everyone brings their account, for example, and then you kind of mash them up against one another and see what arises, right? So if you
Right.
have Thomas Jockin, who's a world expert on classical thought like Aristotle, then you have thinking brought in on Hegel, and I could go on, Hobby, all these wonderful people, Sam. Then what ends up happening is a topic is less likely, in my opinion, to get stuck in a single hermeneutic or a single rationality or framework by which to understand it, right? Like it actually can move, it can kind of spiral in a way and gain a new life. Now, this is only possible, though, if people are willing to use the language of one another, because people have different language games, right? One of the
Right.
reasons why this doesn't happen or can get stuck is because people are very set on a certain language game or a certain philosopher that they want to understand things through. And then if
Right.
other people come in who don't use that philosopher or who don't lose that language game, you basically get lost in a conversation about the terms or fighting over the terms. And
Right.
that doesn't work very well. But over the years, these wonderful people who come to the net, all of them have a shared willingness to work with the language games, the terms, the thinkers that people bring. And that to me is kind of a prerequisite to the possibility of a successful philosophical conversation, unless you want to bring a bunch of people, say, specialized in Aristotle. That's great. Get all those people together. But for me, if you want to get an emergent conversation that's trying to meet the moment, what people are thinking, you need to get that mix. But please, Tom.
Um, but this is also your ability as a moderator to bring these people together, and to synthesize what. And so the question would be, so how much is your own philosophy informed by synthesizing different things?
No, that's a great question. I mean, for me, it's very important to read what everyone coming to the net is writing, what they are talking about, to have a sense of everyone's ideas, so that you can also, if you know that this person is doing a lot of work on economics, and this other person over there has been interested in economics, can you bring up the topic in a manner that would form a certain sense of, oh, we might have something in common, and that can come alive and get things
Right.
going. So there's that sort of sense of things. I absolutely think in terms of synthesis. However, how do I say this? There's a cheap synthesis and there's a costly synthesis. There's the synthesis where you just want to believe all the thinkers are similar, and then you pour in from the top, and that's
Right.
no good. But then there's also a costly synthesis that I believe in, and it's just based on kind of a conviction of, if these people, a lot of these thinkers or these people coming to the net, if they have just, without necessarily getting paid, they've dedicated a lot of their time, or some of these great philosophers, they've dedicated a lot of their life to this thinking, there's probably more to learn from them than not, even if you ultimately disagree. And if you also believe that they have a genuine concern about similar subjects, then it is probably the case that there will be synthesis between them, simply because they're carried by a genuineness to figure out, say, what freedom is, And
Right.
that alone is probably going to make there be synthesis possibilities. But here's the other key. I actually find that the only way to find real differences, and I'll throw it back at you, real differences just based on my work on Leibniz, which is forever indebted to Anthony Morley. The only way to find real differences is to actually bring thinkers together as close as possible. And then then that's when you see the things you didn't even know were differences. Because the
Right.
bringing them in proximity creates what I call the surprise of difference, actually. So
Right.
I actually think it's very important to start with an effort to bring together so that the real differences can emerge versus the differences that you think are there before you bring them together. Because those aren't usually the most fruitful differences. It's the differences you find from the effort to bring thinkers together that's kind of earned and more costly, if that makes sense, Tom.
Sure, sure. So when you say the costly synthesis, does it also imply in a sort of sense that you have to step back from your own preferred worldview and your own preferred method of thinking in a kind of sense, which is always super costly because, this is something I want to get even later, but I mean this in itself is very costly. From psychological effort and from your way of acting within the world and being in the world ultimately.
I think it can be. I think that's a great question thing that you're bringing up. For me, this is actually where doing literature and creative writing is incredibly useful. Because the literary mode, I think if you grant me the phrase great literature, I think that great literature actually often entails efforts of synthesis of escaping a worldview, trying to compare it with other worlds. Like the tragedy of great works is often when people have different ways of seeing the same thing and they genuinely both care about it, but because they interpret it differently, they hurt one another or they talk
Right.
past one another, right? Like to me, you can't really get I think there's something about if you grant me a fancy phrase, a literary mode of being that is actually very necessary if the human wants to thrive, if they want to do well in life, whatever that may mean. That's an open term. That actually is only afforded by this kind of effort of synthesis, which, please, this effort of synthesis is not necessarily, it's not a kind of negation of, say, the dialectic. It's a bringing things together to see how the difference stands out. It's not like they necessarily
Right.
merge. It's an effort, I'd almost call it a bringing together. Like in a great story, you want to be bringing characters together in the same situation, in the same event, actually to create a literary event or to create a powerful story. I will say, I don't think, so this would be my point. I don't think it's by chance that today we see because I think this is unfortunately the case. I don't think it's by chance that there is perhaps less of a general capacity to hold together, dare I say, contradiction or multiple worldviews, or to move beyond a
Right.
framework with the loss of literature, with the loss of actually people who are thinking in terms of novels or working through that different work, right? Because that is going to move you in a more linear direction. Because story brings together difference and holds them in situation, right? Like if that is not a way of thinking that you have, you almost by definition are not going to be able to hold the difference together. It's going to necessarily butt up against one another, and you not be able to hold it. You'll be overwhelmed by the anxiety. You'll be overwhelmed by the difference and retreat back to a single framework. So for me, just personally, I see the work in art, the humanities, et cetera, so forth, as actually also tied to a sort of training of the capacity to move beyond a single language game or a single meta framework. I put those together in my mind.
Right. But the way you describe it, it sounds to me ultimately meta modern because if you look at like a novel, let's say from Hemingway, this is a specific kind of way of experiencing the world he creates. There's no ambiguity in there, especially because it's modernist in a kind of sense. It's matter of fact. It's very clinical, and so the ambiguity you're talking about, this is something that arrived in literature, later, 50 years later, basically, with Infinite Jest and stuff like this.
Oh, I think there's absolutely something to be said if we're taking what Dimber is writing seriously about For me at the net and also in literature, the reason why we are, say, oscillating between language games or oscillating between modernity, postmodernity, oscillating is precisely so that in it, something, a clearing almost like a Heideggerian clearing, like an opening between those of an interior space can be preserved and that can actually in a way come forth. Right? So likewise, in my opinion, if you have a space like the net where you're actually able to generate a between space, the language games, because people are transitioning between, something can come forth that surprises, new ideas can come forth that surprises. And here's kind of a key. If ideas emerge that no one predicted ahead of time or that have a certain surprise to it, they bring with them a certain feeling of reliability, a certain sort of like just like an emotional state that you don't plan for. It gives a certain certainty. Like if it surprises you, it's much easier to believe in because you know you didn't plan it. It just appeared, right? In that between. So it gives a sort, it helps the conversation not feel arbitrary. It helps it feel exciting. And it also gives a certain direction of, oh, that thought that just surprised us is what we need to focus on, right?
Right.
So that character, I am certainly, if one wants to, because terms I'll use with O.G. Rose are emphasizing the surprise, the man on the side of the road, and Ivan Illich, encounterology, like glimmers, glimpses. These are all the things that I think philosophy needs to be focused on versus stable states or of some kind. Because when something surprises you, then it is very difficult to say that that is just a subjective creation because it came from the world beyond you, right? And so there'd be more reason to think that that actually has some reason, some substance by which to investigate.
Right.
Similarly, I think literature needs to create a similar thing so that it feels like it's more than just, dare I say, entertainment or something to pass the time. Like if literature can have something come forth from it that has this kind of surprising character, then that makes a feeling of, I'll sometimes say, ontological stakes. Like this really matters, actually, and that this has something to say about the world that we're living in. That's what I think literature needs to accomplish. There is something I will certainly say based on how Denver writes it. There is certainly something meta-modern about that methodology of this. You could even say, William Desmond talks about metaxis, this sort of between space. That's very important.
So how would you describe what's the core of your own philosophy? Like if you were to describe it, because I mean that's a to synthesize that's certainly a method. For example, I would describe myself like ultimately as a pragmatist,
Mm.
right? So like where's your root motivation you're coming from?
That is a great question. I have some. Hmm. If I were to say what was the topic, so let me see if I can come to a phrase on it. The first really bad philosophy book that Michelle and I wrote was called Ironically, because based on literature, we were convinced that irony was ontological, that it was actually part of reality itself. And irony is where X does Y to get Z, and Y is why X doesn't get Z. And this irony, which is deeper than just misfortune, seems to just be ontological. Like the very human condition seems to be that the very things we do for something are the very reason we don't get it, actually, or that it is kept from us, right? So there's this kind of irony that is part of human efforts of intelligibility and operation in the world.
Right.
So a real emphasis on what would it mean to take that seriously, to tarry with it and not end up with a certain sort of surrender, a sort of giving up, right? The other key concept is, working at Eunoia, we emphasize a lot with beauty, the strike of beauty, but by this we don't mean simply aesthetic symmetry, but more so this quality of experience that seems to be very fleeting, but seems to unveil something that is possible in reality. That but if it can happen once, then if it happens once, then it can happen, even if it never happens again, right? And what exactly are those conditions that make it possible? Like the example I always make from Walker Percy is imagine that you had never heard of the Grand Canyon, that you didn't know what it was, and you're one of these Spanish conquistadors. It wasn't even a term, and you come out of the forest, and there's the Grand Canyon. Like that moment. You've never seen a photograph of it. No one on planet Earth knows it exists, and there it is. That is more of what beauty is, which is very hard to get anymore because now we go to the Grand Canyon to confirm photographs we've seen of the Grand Canyon. We already have a mental complex when we go into these experiences, which also brings to mind Walter Benjamin's aura. And so that kind of quality and intensity of experience, that also becomes very central. That how do we as human beings move in our ironic situation to have these glimmers and glimpses of this beauty, which of course is also kind of the structure of the stories as well. I have used the term phenomenological pragmatist. That's an essay that I've used. I definitely take seriously phenomenology. I definitely take seriously those sort of fields that are asking if I am able to experience this bookcase, what must the conditions of reality be like so that I can experience this bookcase? For me, pragmatism, based on a lot of the Scottish Enlightenment, David Hume, is a necessary kind of bracketing to determine the phenomenological questions you should ask. Because like with pragmatism, like so, for example, David Hume wants us to arrive at our ethics from a raw experience of the suchness of our immediacy, not a category of isness. Like, so instead of asking what ought a cat get, you ask what should the cat that you know by the barn get, right? Like it is based in suchness. And he actually thinks philosophy becomes a force of terror and destruction if you base it on isness versus suchness. And actually, I'm incredibly sympathetic to that. So philosophy has to be bound to suchness, which necessarily brings a pragmatism to it. But this is also a pragmatism that is always open to the surprise of suchness. Like the practice has to be every single time rethought in light of the particular suchness of what you were encountering. You can never have a pragmatism that's based on an abstract isness that you bring to every single situation. And I think the same basically would go with phenomenology. It would be based on a raw experience. Those would be some thoughts.
Okay, so that's interesting. So if you have to where to put your finger on it, so what is that fascinates you? What is it that stirs up your mind, and what are you looking for? Because
You
there's
know,
always something that we're looking for, that's something specific, something that has not itself shown yet, but because we're always in this kind of relationship with the world, and especially with that hasn't manifested yet. There's always something that our attention, involuntarily goes to, because there's something that is not quite clear, and that's the reason, at least from a cognitive viewpoint, it's like why we engaging with the things, philosophically in the first place. So what is it yet from your end? What are you looking for? What is that what stirs you? What fascinates you?
that's actually a great question because another term that we use in reconstructing A is conditionalism, and you could say that I have a great interest in, I want to say conditionalism maybe as a conditionalist, and what I mean by that is conditionalism is a certain middle between say objectivity and subjectivity, and what I mean by that is conditionalism is interested in stuff like, I'll just use the famous example from Owen Barfield of a rainbow. Rainbows require sunlight in a particular location. It requires rain, and you have to be in the right place. Is a rainbow merely subjective? No. If you meet those conditions, there it is, and anyone who's there with you will also have the experience of a rainbow, right? But is a rainbow something that exists in the same way as a table or a rock? No. The conditions of a rainbow are much more fleeting. They're less stable, but they do exist, right? Think about a shadow based on In Praise of Shadows by Tonto Ganji, right? Like to get a shadow, you have to have an object here, the light has to be here, and that creates a shadow. Let's take a veil. A veil is between a wall and nothingness, right? There's a particular condition that affords the possibility of a veil. There's a certain condition that affords the possibility of a rainbow, and so on and so forth. I am extremely interested in possibilities of the world or human experience that are conditional, that we have to figure out the conditions, make those conditions, and then something comes forth that we can participate in. I think a lot about space making. We ran an art gallery venue. I run a venue. Like when the music is just right, when the lighting is just right, there's an architectural sort of effect to things. You can create an aura. When the music is just right, like when there's a certain condition that is made, there can be, some people call it a vibe. There can be an aura. There can be a kind of intimacy that comes forth. But if those conditions are not met, those effects are not there. that's also getting at when I say I'm interested in phenomenology, because if there are these, when the vibe is good, it's not just you. Everyone in the room feels it. It's not just subjective. Like it's like the rainbow, right? So what must the conditions of possibility be in reality itself so that events like this can occur that have this sort of effect on people? What would philosophy look like, or theology, or economics, or I could go on, that took those kind of events as central and really wanted to think those? How would your economics be different? How would your sociology be different? How would you think differently? So for me, thinking through the implications of conditionalism in many, many different fields, we could say that is a driver, certainly.
Right. Okay. So what I'm understanding is that you're referring to a kind of interrelatedness of
Mm,
the human mind and the phenomenon, right?
sure.
Did I
Yeah.
get that right?
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so because we were already talking about Camus, and so I was thinking the other day about, which one was it? The Myth of Sisyphus. And
Mhm.
right at the beginning he quotes Karl Jaspers. I don't know if you
Mhm.
have read the book, and he quotes Jaspers like from his philosophical investigations, and he talks about that Jaspers had the idea that we are unable to grasp the world in its wholeness, and yet we are always thrown into the mix where we always try to you know grapple with the completeness, and not only in terms of metaphysics or worldviews, also like in terms of what's happening in the world right now on the very fundamental worldly kind of level. So we're like in this thresher basically, where we're confronted with the day-to-day life. We have to pay our bills. We are confronted with the meaning crisis or with the culture war, but we also have to grapple with metaphysics and with all these kinds of ideas, and they are way more fluent than and fluctuating, because we as participants are always shifting our perspectives, and so do our perspectives on metaphysics. And so maybe that is a way to go into that direction of this conversation.
Well, I definitely think, again, if I were to throw out terms that I associate with philosophy, rather it be from Hume to, but all Hegel, all of the different thinkers, I associate philosophy with, one, self-defense. If you don't have philosophy and someone throws bad ideas at you, or you can't defend yourself, so
Right,
you get pulled, and that's a big problem. I definitely associate philosophy with a certain sort of almost gauging the correct orientation, like the
right,
proper, so almost, I want to say, a martial arts sort of structure. Because if you can't know the whole, but you have to make decisions about the whole, then how do you gauge the right orientation? Maybe the right orientation today is X, but you move along, and then actually you need to shift a little more to Y, and that can seem relativistic, but actually it's in response to the whole. So it's not
right,
just taste, it's actually a sensibility to actuality. And because there are different emphases at different ages and different situations. So there's a certain skillfulness. I associate philosophy with a certain skillfulness, but it's a skillfulness that is tied to a certain, I want to say, metaphysical sensibility. There's a certain sensibility. Similar in a way to what you're doing with the world, like when you're talking with someone and you can sense, this person's in a bad mood, this is going well. Like there's a certain sense that you can develop between people. I think philosophy is actually working to kind of develop that more so on a grander scale with the world, with other sensibilities. Now,
right,
you could associate this with intuition. Bergson talks about intuition. Now, of course, there's dangers with intuition that Hegel points out at the beginning of the phenomenology of the spirit, which is the notion that people are kind of following their intuition without putting it through conceptual testing. They're not running it, like they're not critiquing it. So you've got to earn your intuition, right? Like there's something
right.
about philosophy that is earning and refining intuition that seems very, very important. I think also philosophy is tied to decision making. I know Forrest Landry emphasizes that. I certainly think that decision making is a big part of philosophy, um, especially in the context where you cannot reduce the decision to a single input. Like, what is the most right? Like, if you have to weigh a bunch of variables, So, which I think actually the most complicated in situations in life do, like what you want to do, what your duties are, what's going to increase freedom, what's going to make money. You have to weigh and consider all of these different variables together, and the answer is not self-evident. There's something about philosophy that is helping you work through these decisions that have a lot of competing variables that have to be taken into account. I think also philosophy is trying to train a certain ability, and I'll pause here before I keep talking. Philosophy is also training an ability to resist the temptation. This sounds odd. Philosophy is training you to resist the temptation to assume that action is better, or that doing something all the time is better, or getting in the fray is better. That also philosophy is training you for a certain awareness that sometimes one quality decision is more important than 50 less quality decisions. Like it
Right,
gets you out of assuming quantity is better. It makes
right.
you more attuned to quality, which I think ties to this kind of idea of how to relate to the whole, even if you can't entirely access the whole, how to navigate that tension well.
Right. And it's super interesting because you mentioned, aligning yourself. And I feel that's especially, in our times, it's the cost of doing it to do, in your words, high quality decisions. These are extremely high because I mean, I think we don't talk enough about the relationship between, let's say, metaphysics and world frames and morals and ethics and what you do
Right?
in a certain situation. But they're all informing each other, and
Absolutely.
only because you reach a certain decision to act or not to act or act in a specific way, that doesn't mean that in a different situation you should use the same action. So you have to align yourself on all levels because that's what aligning means. And the cost of doing this is extremely high because, again, you also have to pay your bills, right? And then there is the hidden cost that it you can say, okay, I have my worldview now. I'm a pluralist, or I'm a monist, or I'm a nihilist, and that's the way to go for all eternity. But the world is shifting, right? And you can't you have to modulate this whole thing in order to align yourself properly in the face of the world and the complexities of the world.
I mean, the other thing with that is philosophy. If you don't do the work of philosophy, which almost one can associate with a gem, you are very likely you're simply going to absorb your thinking from the people around you, like secondhand smoke, as Rand kind of put it, right? Like, because often the best decisions, or dare I say, the best interpretations, and I know you were speaking with Sweeney about narrative fatigue, and I really enjoyed that. Like,
Right,
often the best decisions are not, in my opinion, the best decisions are not reducible to a narrative. They stand outside of the narrative. They're not swept up in the narrative. They get a sense where they say, all of this is dumb. I have no idea. It doesn't involve me. Well, that's actually the truth from which you should make a decision of how to use your
right,
time, right? Like
right,
there's a way in which the problem of getting swept up in, say, narratives about Russia or AI or whatever is you actually are, in a sense, deluding yourself to think that the proper starting point from your thinking is that narrative, when in fact it's often has nothing to do with you. It's kind of trying to pull you in to it
right,
for whatever reason, but you actually need to start in the place of there's something actually very empowering about starting from a certain weakness, which is a certain sort of humility of saying, I have no idea. Like, I don't know. Like,
right.
critically, when Socrates, there's that famous idea that I know nothing, blah, blah, blah. Well, that's a starting point. That's Socrates is locating himself, right? Philosophy has to locate itself in the proper place so that the unfolding is not wasted or just talking, et cetera, and so forth. So the other reason why, for me, philosophy is a really big deal is because there are so many things. It's to preserve, like to protect your attention, to protect your awareness. So, Ivan Illich talks about Simone Weil. It's very difficult, the attention economy, et cetera, and so forth. Like, if you can't protect your attention. It's going to basically, because when your neighbor comes over and starts telling their perspective on AI or the war in Gaza or
Right.
whatever, you don't want to disagree. You've never thought about it. Okay, yeah, no, you're right. We need to do something. And now you're pulled along, right? You're not able to self-defend your clearing, per se. You're not able to self-defend yourself from getting pulled into something, right? Well, once you're pulled along, the likelihood of good decision making or alignment goes down dramatically.
Right.
It becomes much more difficult. So that's another, for me, major factor of why philosophy is important, because it is hopefully training your ability to protect your attention per se, to protect it from getting pulled into something. Because if you can't do that, it's going to be very difficult to be aligned.
So you mentioned irony as an existential in a kind of way, and I find it very interesting because again I've read up today a little bit on Jaspers, and for him subjectivity is not just something that we experience, but also like something that is inherent in
Mm.
this world and appears as soon as you leave the world of objectification behind. That is all this model building, all these ideas that we have about the world, and leave the narrative and the narration and the storytelling behind, and then then subjectivity emerges as an integral part of the cosmos itself. And I think this interplay between this kind of subjectivity and the world building, that is, to walk on that edge, to know when to engage and when to cross the boundary and the border from one to another. That's an integral aspect of aligning yourself, I think.
Well, to me, again, if I were to think to the question of how do I think about myself, or what is it that I'm looking for, or thinking about in philosophy and literature,
Right.
there's a certain experience of I want to say, a coming forth, a strike of beauty, of a certain sort of surprise, of a quality of experience that I have had that I know is possible. And there's a weird way, and we were speaking about this at the net, where, in Heidegger, there's this idea of being toward death, right? That being is structured by future tasks, that, we're more structured by the future than we are the present. It's very difficult to actually be quote unquote present, but also there's a problem if you're present, because then you're not thinking about the future and you don't pay your bills, right? So, or you don't, there's a way in which you're not a being toward death. And for Heidegger, that's a major problem because you're not taking death seriously. And therefore you have a fragmented being. You're not able to, you can't be authentic without taking death seriously, right? Well, completely agree. But there's also like if you have a strike of beauty, like this quality of experience, there's a way in which your being is now, if I use a fancy term of, say, ontotemporally structured, of a kind of bringing back new. Like, and this is very odd because how can you bring back something new, right? Like, how can you bring back something and it not be different? It's the old Deleuze problem of repetition and difference, right? Like, a great work, like every time you write a short story, there's an idea of doing again something that Esperanza or Heroes or those stories did, but doing it in a new way, and then not trying to force the story to just repeat old work, because that's what bad artists do, right? They just write the same story 1,000 times over again, and that's no good. Well, how do you bring back new, that quality of experience the reader should have had if the word succeeded, that stays with them, that changes them? You must change your life in that Rilke sense. How do you do that, right? So there's a kind of bringing back new sort of structure. To me, this is kind of like being toward death, because there's also, I think you have to actually go through, well, one could say that the practice of the artist is going to entail all sorts of existential challenges, blah, blah, blah. But then you have this interesting kind of bringing back new, or being toward a condition, being toward a possible kind of experience. This kind of experience is only possible because of subjectivity in the world. And
Right.
subjectivity seems to be part of the world in a deep way, in that because subjectivity lets these qualities kind of come forth. I've been reading Thomas Wynne, who's a wonderful Heideggerian scholar. He has a tremendous dissertation that he just finished, where he's talking about the later Heidegger, which he argues is dramatically understudied. The early Heidegger being in time is studied, the middle Heidegger a bit more, but the later Heidegger is basically forgotten. And the later Heidegger is dealing with this problem that being, the moment I talk about being, it's not being, right? Like the moment I try to establish truth, it's my take on truth. It's the problem. You could just say the problem of
That's what
subjectivity.
Jaspers said. That's the same thing. Yes.
Oh, delightful. So you've got this problem of every time I talk about a truth, there's a sort of, it's slipping away. It's getting away from me.
You
right?
already crossed the boundary, the border of into the other realm. Exactly.
That's exactly right. So the question, when Heidegger starts talking about letting or clearing, there's a certain, can the subject stand on the boundary per se and not cross it, but stand there and let come forth what comes forth? Because if you stand there, something might come forth that can come forth, and because you don't step across the boundary, there's reason to think that this thing
Right.
coming forth is not merely subjective. It's afforded by subjectivity. Because there is subjectivity, it's possible to have this experience, but it's not merely subjective.
Right.
Maybe only that of which meets the condition of having subjectivity can have this experience. Say the vibe of a jazz improvisation, you would need subjectivity to enjoy that, but can one reduce the power of an improvisational jazz improvisation to your individual subjectivity?
Mm.
No, it requires, there's a perhaps collective subjectivity, but your individual subjectivity, not at all. It requires this sort of collective element. And if you can stand on that boundary of the clearing, what comes forth, there is reason to think, although you can't have certainty, of course, but you can have confidence. There's reason to think that what comes forth, the terms that Thomas Wynne uses is letting. When you let being be, to use, then what comes forth, there's reason to think that that quality is not simply reducible to your subjectivity. That it could actually, there would be reason to think that this quality of experience is afforded to subjectivity in general, to
Right.
the very, of which is always in relation with the world, thus as
Right.
interrelationality. And I think about that a lot with the kind of work. I'm looking for those boundaries in the work,
Right.
looking for those places to stand so that something can come forth.
I think, what I'm thinking of now is Baudrillard and his idea of the symptom,
Mm,
that event or that phenomenon that does not fit to your current worldview by
yes.
definition, and that is challenging. But these things need each other, and they're like in a kind of dialectic, and I mean, you have probably made the experience, the moment you have the perfect understanding of the world or situation, something happens and completely destroys it, and so it's like on a very basic level, it's like, you have an idea, and it works, and suddenly, but this is also a way to invoke the new, and this is, I guess, what you mean with standing on the edge. It's like you can actually invoke the new by pursuing a form of completeness, because the universe hates completeness, and then it just comes rushing in and destroys, like Saturn, basically.
Oh yeah. No, absolutely. Well, another way to put it, based on, the book we did, The Map is Indestructible, is that all maps, which another term for is internally consistent system, ergo worldview, Christianity, atheism, it doesn't matter. They are internally consistent system, meaning if you accept, I'll just use Christianity as an example. If you accept the first principles of Christianity, which you may not, but if you do, then and its underlying axioms of how reality works, then there is nothing within the theology of Christianity that is a necessary contradiction. You may not buy the answer, but there is an address within the theology. Therefore, it is internally consistent. It may not correspond with reality, because coherence and correspondence are different, but there is nothing within the map that is what I call an essential contradiction. And I would argue so it goes with Austrian economics. If we literally had a pure free market, then Austrianism would follow. The problem is that we may never actually have a purely free market, because it always passes over into a mixed market, as Paul Planier says, or something like that, right? Same goes with communism. If you actually did everything that comes out, it would work out. The problem is, in practice, it doesn't necessarily ever achieve that consistency, right? But there's always an internal consistency, which actually creates a lot of problems, because if you're just using rationality as your guide, since your worldview is internally consistent, there is never necessarily reason to change it or to leave it. You can just trace out the internal consistency all your life, right?
Right.
Well, this could pose a problem in pluralism, because everyone is just in their internally consistent system, and then they're banging up against one another, and they have to figure out how to get along, and they're going to figure out how to get along through the hermeneutic of their map, which the other people may not like that. I don't
Right.
like how you define getting along with me. There was that funny George Shaw. He was the playwright. He had that idea of, do unto others what you would do unto yourself. But what if they don't like it? What if what you like having done to you is not
Yeah,
what
yeah,
they
yeah.
like? And that's always the problem. But the idea that the book argues is that it's, and the book tries to investigate the originator of the phrase, the map is not the territory, is a man named Alfred Korbowski. He wrote a tremendous book called Science and Sanity. That
Krasipsky, isn't it?
Yes, that's correct. I mispronounce things all the time. Krasipke. So words are hard. The idea is that if maps are not the territory, then there must be a point in a map that actually divulges that it's not the territory, right? And the irony is it's usually in its very completeness. Because if a map is complete, then it can't be reality because reality is open. And also a map that was complete would have to be as big as the territory and therefore useless.
Right.
You could not comprehend it, right? So what, the book wants to argue is that that moment of completeness can function as a certain Gödel point. Kurt Gödel is who I have in mind. And because he's the one who famously shows if in an axiomatic system you get coherence, you don't get correspondence, but if you get correspondence, you don't have coherence. So there's a trade-off. You have to choose between those two, right? So for me, every map entails a Gödel point. That becomes the standing on the edge. If you can get people to stand on the edge in their worldview, then that actually becomes a orientation from which something can come forth that is beyond the map, and yet here's the key, they don't have to leave the map for this experience. Because if your game is to let's get everyone to change their map so that they don't kill each other or get rid of maps, you're done for. That will never work. Because maps are internally consistent. There will never be reason for people to listen to you. Because the consistency of their worldview says they shouldn't. But if every map is not the territory, and there's more to the argument than this, because we get into Zizek, we get into Alston Fair, other people, is that if every map necessarily has a point, a Gödel point, then this could be the kind of singular universality, this repeating isomorphic point that all worldviews have that afford the possibility of us standing on the edge, that things could come forth that
Right.
are something more than people's worldviews, that would actually, there'd be more reason to think that it's a view of the world precisely because it is on that edge. And that also becomes a point of interaction between people that is not reducible to their maps, but also does not demand that they leave their maps. And I associate the Gödel point with that Heideggerian clearing, with that letting, with that coming forth of quality. So those things go together for me.
Okay, so I think we have set the stage now for the question, which we all, set out to answer and to convene today, because I wrote you, I think, when was it, like 6 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago,
Sure,
that
sure,
we should
sure.
do a podcast about Charlie Kirk's death and the culture war and fatigue and all of this and the meaning crisis. And I feel like now we have set the stage, and now comes the little pirouette that you can do. So how do you personally and philosophically approach, the world as it is presented to us in this way of the meaning crisis, of the culture war? Is there a way to frame it philosophically that does not necessarily go into sociology? And because we all know this kind of stuff, psychology,
Sure.
like how, if you were to align yourself and make sense of that which doesn't make a lot of sense, right? So where would you start?
Well, for me, I think Kirk is basically an event that functions as a certain revelation that everyone is trapped in internally consistent systems that they can't get out of. And that basically, I have in mind too, there's a short story by Dostoevsky. I believe it is called The Eternal Husband. And it starts off with a body lying on the table. Like in Russia, you put a body on the table, I believe it's 3 days. And it's kind of this raw facticity. And I believe it's the husband who is then, because of this body, has to keep going back and recalling what happened because of this raw event that won't go away, that you can't avoid. It forces him to recall, right? Well, what ends up happening when you have something like Charlie Kirk gets killed is it functions like that body. It's a brute fact. It's a brute event that occurred. And now you are forced to decide how you think about it, right? Like, because
Right.
you have seen it. If Charlie Kirk's still alive, you can kind of ignore him, or maybe you follow him, it doesn't, but he's still, it's not like this body on the table, right?
Right.
Because when the body is on the table, it forces the husband to ask a question. Am I why she killed herself? Because the wife, I think it's the woman, she killed herself, right? So he's asking, is it my fault? or not, because this happened and I can no longer exist in a world where it didn't occur, right? So likewise, what happens is when someone like Charlie Kirk dies, and you are forced to ask, what do I think of that? Because there are many people who think Charlie Kirk is contributing to, fascism. There are other people who think he's a defender of free speech. You find yourself in a situation where you have to use suddenly and all at once whatever you have at hand by which to interpret what occurred, right? And what that's going to be is your map. And the issue is that everyone then ends up just kind of tracing out the internal consistency of their worldview and following it if A, then B, then C, then D, then back to A. So you trace it out. But then the people over here go, well, if A, then B, then C, and they trace it out. And then it turns out that these two structures that people are in are basically, as maps, not dwelling in their girdle point, as I would put it, are incompatible, or certainly suggest very seriously different views that seemingly could only be resolved by violence or various forms of extremism. So, for example, many people with Charlie Kirk would go, well, if you think he's Joseph Goebbels, are you against killing Joseph Goebbels? Is that really so bad? Right? And you go,
Right.
but no, he's not Joseph Goebbels. How can you say that? And then, of course, people go through ICE or whatever, right? And so what ends up happening is you find yourself in a situation because then your neighbor's talking about it, you go to work and they're talking about it, and they ask you, and it becomes the other key is when Kirk dies, it becomes part of the kind of chit chat, almost in a Heideggerian say. It's part of the conversation. You just find yourself in it. And when you find yourself in it, and perhaps you haven't been going to the gym of philosophy, training through different thoughts, all you can do is basically almost like a character in a Kafka novel. You're just kind of forced to go down the path, the tunnel of your worldview that you usually don't think about. But when you do, it has almost a preset determination. It has a kind of a preset discourse in it. That's a term that Javier Rivera was bringing up. Is like the moment I describe, you just see it in the language itself, how it has a kind of I've described it like gutters in bowling. You know how in bowling, when your ball goes in the gutter, it just kind of goes down the path? Like the very terms that people use to refer to events bring with them a kind of gutter that sets the trajectory. If I say that Charlie Kirk was a family man, that has a kind of trajectory. But if I describe it, say, well, Charlie Kirk was a pundit, that has a kind of trajectory. And if I
Right.
say Charlie Kirk was a Trump supporter, that kind of has a sort of gutter that goes with it, right? So for me, the first thing we say that just comes to mind is that Kirk's death unveils how words bring gutters, how we're trapped in internally consistent systems, and how basically rationality and interpretation is making these crystalline structures that then it can't really get beyond if it is only using its own resources. And then basically what just happens is there's no resolution. People's attention just changes. Now it's on peace deals in the Middle East, or it's on the AI or whatever. It's not that we actually resolved the tension. We just moved on from it. But that tension is still latent. That will come out on more and more. It will just keep coming back on bigger and bigger scales until one day the maps hit, and then there is major violence. That's always the tip. So I'll pause there.
Okay, so I just had it. Because like why do you think that is? What from your point of view, like philosophically speaking, why is it that way that people get engulfed in their own landscapes and maps of meaning, basically? So because it was not always the case, and lots of people say, okay, it's the internet and la la la, but the internet is just one quadrant, so there has to be like other factors as well. And so philosophically speaking, if you had to point your finger on it, it's like where, like metaphysically speaking, where does it come from? Why does the world appear in that way at the moment? Is there
Uh,
like a metaphysical explanation from your point of view for that?
it's an excellent question. I think that is because the way I would describe it in the truism of the rational is because rationality comes after a non-rational activity, experience, decision, judgment. And by non-rational, I don't mean irrational. I mean that of which cannot be made intelligible by rationality alone. So, for example, if you, at the root of Charlie Kirk is going to be a certain judgment of what you think is a fitting analogy. If I, and I was speaking with Thomas Jockin about geometric mean and proportional analogy in Aristotle. But what I mean by this, if I say to you, Charlie Kirk is like Joseph Goebbels, do you buy that or not? A lot of people, and is it rational to buy that or not, right? Some people would say that is a fitting analogy. Like, and by analogy, it's not merely a metaphor. An analogy is a comparison that is a kind of entire logical structure by which to understand a person's behavior. Like, a metaphor would be if I say, she runs like a cheetah. An analogy would more so be like if I said, she is a cheetah. The reason why the second is an analogy is it's kind of an opening, like to think of, oh, she must like to sleep in trees, maybe, or she's fast, or it opens an entire vista of associations, right? Where in the metaphor, I contain the cheetah comparison to running, right? So what ends up happening is if I say Charlie Kirk is like Joseph Goebbels, and you say yes, that is a fitting analogy, then what you will find rational to do when faced with Charlie Kirk will be very different, right? It will be very different than if you said that's not a fitting analogy, right? That is not proper. But here's the weird thing. Can you reduce that judgment to rationality? Is it rational to say yes or no to that, right? It's more of an intuition. It's more of an experience. It's more of a gathering of data. Maybe you've read the biography, maybe you've not. For most people, it is a non-rational assent that is based on what you believe is a fitting comparison or not, right? For the conservative, they may say that is a that is an immoral and horrible comparison and has no reality whatsoever. For someone that's more of an American liberal, they would buy that comparison, of which will then generate an entire different landscape. Another thing, so I think Thomas Sowell's best book is A Conflict of Visions, and I'll use that as an example. And in that book, he makes a distinction between a tragic vision, a constrained vision of reality and an unconstrained vision of reality. So a constrained vision would be more conservative. And the constrained vision is the notion that, like, for example, we can't make a perfect world. That people are always going to be tragic, they're always going to make mistakes, and we're constrained by the reality of human nature, quote unquote, from what kind of world we can make, right? The unconstrained is like, yeah, sure, we're constrained now by human nature, but maybe human nature can change with time, maybe under different social conditions, et cetera, so forth, right? Based on which of those visions you buy, what is rational or what is not rational changes dramatically. What makes a good society or not changes dramatically, right? But which one of those views is rational, right? Which one of them is rational? Well, you can't start with rationality. Let me put it this way. You have to go and experience the world, and then you can make a rational judgment. This is the key tricky move, right? You can't just, as a disembodied head between those two views, determine what is rational. You'd have to go in the world and have experiences and pay attention and then base your rationality on those experiences. But the experiences themselves are quote unquote non-rational. They come before what you determine is rational in order to give substance to your judgment, right? But what if you choose never to go into the world? What if you choose just to stay at home? What if you choose, well, then, you can basically just pick between which either one you want, right? So then what is plausible to you between those visions is tied to your life experiences and your choices and the situations you put yourself in. And so this is my point. People have different experiences. They put themselves in different situations. They've encountered different people. They've tried different things. Therefore, which of those visions, and this logic applies to many more axioms and whatever, but which of those visions is plausible to who and why will vary because of the lived experiences they've had, because of where they grew up and what they've done. So then you get these different rational landscapes, right? Which, of course, begs the question of, well, then are we all locked in our particularity and there's no hope of universality and global blah, blah, blah. But that, which is a very important question, but that would be for me, so metaphysically, and for Hegel, metaphysics is logic. They're all tied together. And epistemology and ontology are all tied together. The problem is because the true isn't the rational. And by true, I mean the non-rational variable. There are distinct categories. What you believe is true determines what is rational, but you cannot determine what is true for you with rationality alone. That's called autonomous rationality, and it's disembodied and it doesn't work. It creates what I call self-effacement. And pathologies abound. That is the truth of the human condition that leads to all sorts of challenges that if we don't take seriously, I think we end up in a lot of trouble. So that's what I would say.
Right. What's striking is, I mean, talking about Charlie Kirk or the culture war in general, it seems to be, you know, an immense noise that is produced at the time. And I'm wondering why that is, because it wasn't always the case, and like in terms of Democrats and Republicans. I mean, the I feel like, speaking of, you know, beating a dead horse, but Lyotard spoke about, the grand narratives, that are shattering, and now it's a war of micro narratives, and the way that, Kennedy and Nixon basically shared the same worldview, even though they were like on different political ends. That seems unthinkable today. It's like now, if you compare like a New York woman with a guy living in Texas, they're literally living in two complete different worlds. And so that is an interesting phenomenon. And you could make the case, and the case has been made, it has something to do with Foucault and epistemes and different ways of how we understand the world, and that it's ramped up to such extreme that the whole culture is now not a debate about what we could do, or, it's like, I was just, I told you this, I was in Paris, in the beginning of the year, and visiting Andrew, and I went to this museum of, the Rodin Museum, right? And so and there were like images and photographs of, the social events that happened when he presented the thinker, right? And so there was a time before television and radio was just coming up, but there was like this whole thing, and rows of seats, like in a wedding, and people would go there and they would just sit there, and contemplating the thinker, and it was a huge cultural event, and people were thinking about this for weeks and months to end. And so because they had a shared understanding of what the world is about. And so now we are just, the whole of culture is just diverse, like, um, it's conflict, it's culture war, and everybody's having sides. And so I was wondering if there is a connection between our morals, our ethics, and our metaphysics. Like, what is the root algorithm, the root metaphysical problem that is trickling down in our world as this culture war that we are experiencing? Is it that, from your point of view, is it that the big narrative just failed, or, that modernity, as Andrew said today in this podcast today, comes to an end, and we're seeing all these things that's not working anymore? What's your take on this? I mean, I'm rambling on now, but I think
No,
you
no,
get
no,
where I'm coming
no.
from.
So generally, the major problem is that the opening essay of conflict of mind, because all of this is the horizon of the conflict of mind, is that truth organizes values, and truth is really hard to determine. So, for example, if I think you are upstairs and and you come down and I call you and you don't come down, and then I see you later and it's like, why didn't you come down when I called you? And you say, well, I wasn't upstairs. Then because of what I believe is true, I think you're lying, right?
Right,
Because of what I think is the case. So I think the value of the assessment of you are lying applies based on what I think is true, right?
right,
So the issue is all ethics are relative to what we believe is true.
right.
And what we believe is true can vary. So, there's many things. So, for example, one of the great problems with, to make the example of racism is that if I say all people are equal, but this minority is not human, well, then I'm an ethical person, even if I mistreat them because they're not human, right? So, critically, a lot of people talk about ethics as relative. No, every civilization believed murder was murder. They just disagreed on what killing fell under the category of murder. But the category itself was actually absolute. So it also goes with theft and et cetera, so forth, right? But that's really important because what that means is that ethics is always present in an assessment of truth. Like, you can't talk about truth or what you believe is the case without also creating an ethic. But what people have done is they said ethics is relative as if we don't need to consider it. And that's led us to being cell shocked when we see the return, the revenge of ethics, if you will, because that's what you're seeing, this kind of revenge of ethics. Whether it be in wokeism or conservatism or whatever, it's a kind of revenge of ethics because you can't get rid of ethics because you can't have a belief on what you think is the case and from that not arrive at what ought to occur. Critically, critically, when David Hume is saying you can't get from ought to is, he's making that argument to show that ought is derived from suchness, from a direct experience. Now, I'd have to justify this claim. He is extremely concerned about, like kings from far away, saying what their people are, and then passing laws for what they should do from far away, because he knows what the people is, per se, like what they are. So Hume sees isness as a way of manipulation and controlling people with ethics, right? But he deconstructs is ought for the sake of binding the ought to the suchness, right? To people's lived experience. And the issue is you can never escape that. Because when I see a leaking pipe says to me I ought to stop it from leaking, right? It brings with it a certain directionality of activity from the experience. So likewise, when people are encountering what's going on in their world, when they are reading things online, it brings with it a certain thrust of what they ought to do. And you can't get rid of that. You can't shake that. You feel it. If it is true that this group of people is being abused by a government somewhere, it ought to be stopped. Now, you may say, I can't do anything about it, but but the case would be that if you could, then you ought to, right? So the reason why I describe this is because what's happening is everyone is caught in between what I call a conflict of mind. And this is due to the internet. This is due to a lack of a shared canon, shared experience, shared information, which is a conflict of mind is when epistemic possibility comes in conflict with epistemic responsibility. And what I mean by that is, for example, if you are told the government is manipulating you, then you feel a responsibility to find out, but it's literally impossible for you to go to Washington, D.C., go into the Pentagon, and find out all of these things. So you're stuck with this feeling of, I need to find out the truth, I need to determine what's really going on, but it's not actually possible for you to do that. And you exist in this perpetual tension, right? In that anxiety, people are very likely to look for something to make their situation more solid. And the way they can do that is by making the liberals the bad guy or the conservatives the bad guy, making a certain enemy, because that gives a certain directionality in that anxiety. I think also what ends up happening is in an age of a sort of shared intelligibility or a shared canon, then also if there is any conflicts between what people can know and what they can do, they're the same ones your neighbor have, right? So you can communicate with them. Whereas if you've gone online and you've read some articles that your neighbor hasn't, and you've seen some things that seem plausible, but you don't know how to investigate them, you can feel very alone with that conflict of mind situation. And your neighbor could have other things that are compelling them, and then you meet, and you don't know if you can relate to one another on terms of those topics. So there's a sort of withdrawal that occurs. Or a certain sort of, well, if I voice my perspective on what the government is doing right now, maybe my neighbor won't talk to me anymore. So there's a certain isolation that begins occurring. But to answer the question, and then I'll throw it back to you, the root problem is that truth organizes values. When you have a society that, say, are generally watching the same shows, they are listening to Walter Cronkite, the same news, then there's a kind of binding to the truth that people are debating the values that follow from that truth. So if we all are witnessing X, and we are all basically believing that X represents the truth to some degree, then we can have a debate on what values or oughtness follows from that truth, or what is rational following from that truth, right? But if everyone is getting their information from different sources, then we first have to debate, before we can have a democratic debate about what we ought to do based on what we think is truth, we have to debate what truth we even ought to be having the value discussion from, right? And you get stuck there, because how do you determine which of those stories ought to be the one that gets the most of your attention? So right now, should you be primarily focused on, say, the Middle East? Should you be primarily focused on AI? Should you be primarily focused on global warming? Should you primarily be focused on the data centers they're building downtown? What should give your attention? What should you focus your attention on, right? Well, Sarah over there thinks the data centers are a much bigger deal than what's going on in the Middle East. John over there thinks Sarah is a kind of monster to not be caring about what's going on in the Middle East and to be so egotistically focused on data centers, right? So they have a debate on what they're focusing on. And that could go on forever, because how would that debate even end, right? And we haven't even moved to the conversation of what we ought to do about data centers or ought to do about AI, because we can't even agree on which of those topics should be the focus that we have right now, that then we have a value debate relative to, right? So in the past, you would have a higher probability of a shared truth that people would be debating the values regarding. Now you have a disagreement on what is the truth or the thing that we ought to focus about, and you never even get beyond that. Because there's not even a shared agreement on what it is we should be focusing on or what is even a problem. Like some people don't even think AI is a problem, right? Okay, well then how would you begin a conversation with those people, right? Or people that do think it's a problem. So you get kind of siloed. So I think also without the last thing I'll say, like you're saying, like if you had a work of art and you had a presentation or a large gathering of people for it, it creates the feeling of this being the creation of a social conversation or a conversation that the entire society can be having, or it becomes a kind of lived experience that we can share in. Now people don't know if the stories they're reading, the news that they're hearing is something they can share in with other people, because the society has not made a point to create the spaces of that sharing in. And as a result, there's a siloing that occurs, which creates an anxiety in that aloneness that then can look like this explosion of people between one another, because every single worldview necessarily brings a feeling of an ethical response to that worldview. And people feel trapped in that. They don't know what to do about it. And that can create a tension that leads to them blowing up. So those are some thoughts that come to mind.
Right. Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. And I have a couple of thoughts. Maybe I find a way to articulate them in a meaningful way. So what I liked what you said is the relationship between value and truth. And you used the phrase revenge of ethics, right? And let's keep that in mind for a second. And so because I think it was Jaspers, he said that, we can basically have three different worldviews. We can have like a monist worldview, a dualist, or like a nihilist worldview. Like monism, for example, being panpsychism, integral theory is some form of unifying theory. Dualism is dualism, mind body. Even pluralism is a sort of dualism kind of thing. And then you have nihilism with its, play forms like solipsism. And nihilism doesn't is not necessarily bad. It's just a way of renouncing and creating a distance. And so what I, when I'm zooming out, what seems to me happening what seems to me is happening, that we are in a state of absolute plurality or dualism in a kind of sense. Everybody's in their micro narratives. Everybody is siloing in their worldview. There is no shared, worldview anymore. That's one side. And on the other side, going back to what you said, do you think it might be possible that this revenge of the ethics is us searching for um, some novelty, to looking for something, on the edge of that border? We haven't found it yet, where we can shift from plurality and dualism back to some shared worldview. Is it something, that society just at that very moment is just utterly confused and just looking the point where, we can, we find the information that makes us whole again in some sense? That does it
I,
make
I
any sense for you? What I'm just what I'm just
100%. Yes, because when you feel as everything's falling apart, ethics brings a certain oughtness. Therefore, there's a certain power, so there's a potential to bring together, right? Because it could bring everyone in the trajectory of those ethics, right? It
right,
could bring a certain shared intelligibility in the ethics.
right,
The problem, and this is why you can't do ethics without ultimately metaphysics. And what we've tried to do is we've tried, basically, you could say, for a long time now, to do ethics without metaphysics. But you cannot do that because truth organizes value. What you believe you ought to do is tied to what you believe is the case. And what applies. And ultimately, like again, like to put it this way, because also metaphysics is traditionally tied to the question of categories, what categories apply to what, which is tied to a question of judgment. If you define X killing as murder, that generates a oughtness that is very different if the same X killing to you isn't murder. It doesn't fall under that category. Same phenomenon, X killing, let's say the killing of animals, because that's a debated topic right now. For many people, the killing of animals is simply the killing of animals. It is not the murder of animals, right? So you have a very different world based on that metaphysical judgment. It is a metaphysical judgment because you believe animals are not afforded dignity in the same way of human beings, blah, 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 for whatever reason, blah, 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 blah. But it's based on a judgment and ultimately an analogical judgment, right? Based on the right conceptual model by which to think of humans, right or wrong. The point is there's a judgment. Rather it's right or where it's wrong, it doesn't matter. There's a judgment that says the killing of animals is not murdering animals, but someone else, killing of animals equals murder of animals, right? Well, you're in a very different world. Those are very relative, very, very different economies, very different societies, etc., so forth. Who's right? Who's wrong? Right. Whose judgment is right and who's wrong, right? It's all going to be tied down ultimately to a metaphysical debate. And if you have a society that doesn't have the capacity for metaphysical debate, you're stuck. You're stuck there. Because there's no... So one of the great ideas of democracy, which of course is critique now, but an idea of democracy is the possibility of convincing people. If I said to you it was literally impossible to convince people, then almost by definition democracy would be wasted. It would not be it would just be a joke, right? If you couldn't convince people. Well, democracy with shared intelligibility is a democracy where people can be convinced, right? Because we have the same intelligibility, so we have the same truth. So we're going to debate the oughtness from that truth. But because we have a shared truth, maybe it doesn't occur, but in theory, it should be possible to convince people because we're at least in the same world, I want to say, if you grant me that. We're in the same category. Okay, but what if people have different metaphysics? What if they judge different things? Well, the only possibility of saving democracy is to somehow learn the art of metaphysical argumentation or convincing people in terms of metaphysics or the non-rational or experience. How do you do that? What does that look like? How do you go about doing that? Well, I can tell you one of the main ways that people change fundamental beliefs is not rationality, but experience. So, for example, let me use the animal example. People go to a mass manufacturing place of food. They see the animals being killed. They see what occurs, and then they don't want to eat meat anymore. Now, but maybe someone on the outside says, well, that's just brainwashing. That's just propaganda, right? So they may not even take that perspective. But the point is, usually what changes people into a different metaphysical judgment is an experience, right? Right. So if you want to return, so this is the point. What we have now is a question of what is the kind of experience in a world that is stuck in metaphysical divisions that make convincing people seemingly impossible, and therefore democracy seems doomed. You basically seem, in a world where you can't have metaphysical democracy, if you grant me that phrase here, it basically seems destined for either a totalitarian structure or a whole lot of small fascist states. It's going to be one of those two. Small fascist states or, I don't know, China techno AI structure or something like that, right? Neither of those seem great. But you have to somehow figure out how to have a democracy that can take into, or liberalism, quote unquote, that can take into account metaphysics and metaphysical discussion. But metaphysical discussion isn't what tends to change people. It tends to be experience. So how do you figure out how to, dare I say, share experiences, and what kind of experiences, so that it doesn't just feel like propaganda or brainwashing? Well, this gets back for me to the Gödel point. This gets back to the standing on the edge. This gets back to the literature. This gets back to that space that opens up in Dimber's work between the oscillation, that where something comes forth. For me, all of this points to really, really getting focused on creating spaces of a certain kind of experience that something can come forth, like we talked about at the net or literature. That conditionalism, to me, starts getting at the only space in which a kind of metaphysical democracy is possible, and anything outside of that is not going to work. simply because people don't have a shared experience to then determine where the metaphysical difference should fall, to determine the direction that we should take things, right? And right now, the way people, well, let me say it this way. Right now, if people try to do that, it feels like propaganda. You make a bunch of movies that make the conservatives seem right, and you say, oh, that's propaganda, right? Or you
Right.
have the information fall. So, how do you create experiences that make possible metaphysical democracy without it being propaganda, without it being manipulation, without it being just home, maybe a family keeping their kids concealed from the world and telling them what to think, right? That gets into a certain architecture, a certain thinking. I'll pause there.
Oh, well, I mean, to close this off, I mean, it is, Schopenhauer's argument that he said something like, the only thing that will save humanity is art. So there you have it.
Right, right. Oh no. Well, in that art, to me, again, I don't think it's by chance. And again, I'll just reference Heidegger as Thomas Wynne talks about. Heidegger gets very interested in poetry. He gets very interested in this kind of use of language that, in its very signification, entails what he calls a certain annihilation, a certain negation. That for this moment, there's a kind of breakthrough. Like I think it was Beckett. He helped James Joyce write Finnegan's Wake. And Beckett once said, that James Joyce's goal in Finnegan's Wake was to make water wet, was to make the word dance dance. What he's trying to do is close the gap between the
Right.
signifier and the signified in Finnegan's Wake. There's a way in which, in my opinion, Heidegger is actually trying to do something different because he sees that being often comes forth in the clothing of language. It comes forth in language, right? Well, what would be a use of language that would allow the being to come forth through the language but not be reducible to the language, right? That to me is getting at the kind of art that is needed, as Schopenhauer's point, like art that accomplishes that somehow, language that accomplishes that somehow, space making that accomplishes that somehow. And what would it mean to make those sort of spaces? That I think about that a lot.
Daniel, that was a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. And maybe we continue this um, another time, right?
Absolutely. Yes, sir.
That was
Absolutely.
fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tom. I enjoyed every minute of it. I don't know where the time goes. Thank you. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, the time always flies by, you know?
It does. It does. Absolutely.